Hello and welcome. This is the second devlog for a game I'm now calling Project Bounty. If you happen to watch the first devlog, you've noticed that I have changed the name. And there's actually a good reason for that, and I will get into that later on in this devlog. In this devlog though, I'm going to talk about 2 new weapons I've added, new shop and status UI logic, and as mentioned, needing a new name. Alright, well let's get into it. So the first new weapon I made, I actually teased in the first devlog, and it's this purple beam that bounces off stuff, and I am calling it the bounce beam. Now, unlike the first beam you start out with, the bounce beam is limited in range. Your first beam can actually shoot all the way across the screen, and you can even charge it for a bigger blast. The bounce beam, however, has a limited range, but it can bounce off walls and enemies, and can hit more than one enemy at a time. Also, instead of just shooting the beam straight, you actually shoot it down and it bounces off the ground and heads up at somewhere around a 45-degree angle. I can't remember exactly, but that way it'll always have an arc as it bounces. Your original gun only does 1 damage unless it's a charged beam, and then it can do up to 3 damage. So I was thinking with the bounce beam, I was going to stick around 2 damage to put it right there in the middle. The next weapon I added, I'm calling the cross beam. And the reason I'm calling it that is because when you first fire your projectile, it'll travel for about 1/3 of a second, and then it explodes into 4 smaller projectiles that travel in like an X formation. And while the range may be small for the cross beam, the damage that it could potentially output, I think makes up for that. I really want to add an interesting variety of weapons to this game while keeping it balanced, but we're going to see how that works out. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to talk about is the shop and status window UI logic. So in the last devlog, I showed off the shop window and kind of a little bit of the status window, but I didn't really go into depth on what it did or how it functioned. And the reason for that is because it didn't. Being completely honest here, the shop logic and the status logic just did not exist. You could scroll through the items in the shop window, but you couldn't actually buy them or even use them. I had just simply made it so that you could shoot 2 different guns at once for testing purposes, and that's why you saw 2 different guns being used. Now when you go to the shop menu, instead of just window shopping, you can actually buy items now, as long as you've got the gradium to pay for it. Being completely honest here again, I've actually only got the logic to buy items for 1 item. But now that I've got that logic down, I can just apply it to all the other items. You know, simple. So the way the shop works anyways is you can scroll to the item you want. In this case, it'll be our bounce beam. And as long as you don't own it and it's highlighted, you press A, and a little dialog box will open up asking you if you're sure you want to buy it. Selecting no will simply close out the window, but if you select yes, you will now buy the item. After you buy the item, another dialog box pops up letting you know you now own it. And then after that, the item in the shop will be highlighted by a purple square. This purple square is simply there to let you know that you already own this item. So at the time of the last devlog, the status window actually did absolutely nothing. It simply existed because I thought I wanted to do something with it. I just didn't have an idea on what I was really gonna do with it. But thankfully, I've worked all that out, and now I know what I'm gonna do with it. The status window will exist to tell you your player's current health, your rank, how many times you've died, and what items you currently own and have equipped. Before I go into too much depth on the status window, I should explain how items are classified. Currently in Project Bounty, there are only 2 classes of items, those being weapon upgrades and player upgrades. Weapon upgrades being obvious, it's your gun, and currently the idea is you'll only be able to equip 1 gun at a time. Player upgrades, on the other hand, are things like your double jump and your dash. I haven't quite decided whether you'll be able to use 1 or more of these at any given time, because I'm worried that it might make the player a little too overpowered. After some more testing though, I'm sure I'll figure it out. Alright, so with that said, let's get back to our status UI. So the idea here is that the player is going to start out with 1 weapon, that being your starting gun, and 1 player upgrade. that's going to be run. And the way that run works is you simply press Y and your player will start running. And while you're running, not only do you move faster, but you actually jump a little further. But once you start shooting, you'll go back to your normal walk state. Now this is where I'm on the fence. I want to keep the run state, but I also want you to be able to do things like double jump and dash as well. But then that gives the player 2 player upgrades, which kind of just seems a little unfair to me. But fun comes first, so if it's more fun to do it that way, that's what I'm gonna do. And with further testing, I'll be able to tell if it's overpowered or not even better. So for now, the player's sticking with 2 player upgrades, run, and whatever else. So anyways, once an item is bought from the shop, it will appear in the player status menu. And from the player status menu, you'll be able to choose to use the upgrade or not. If you select the item and press A simple dialog box pops up and asks the player if they want to use the item or not. Again, only the bounce beam works at the moment, but now that I got the logic figured out, I just have to apply it to the rest of the items. Now, before we move on to the name of the game and having to change it, I'd like to talk about 1 or 2 little minor things that I fixed as well. And the first thing being this little green square that appeared on the UI menus. Well, all of them except the status menu because it had no logic. These green squares were actually the items used to control the logic of the menus, and they were only there for me to make sure that they were actually in the scene when the scene started. And I've actually gone through and made them all invisible, so you can't even see them. They still exist within the scene itself, but you can't interact with them as the player. And they only exist in the player shipped scene anyways. Another small change I made was with the logic in the shop and status UI. So there was a bug that made it so that you could close out the menu while the dialog boxes popped up on the shop and status menu. And then the dialog boxes would just be kind of stuck there until you open the menu again. And after a good while of beating my head over the keyboard, I finally realized the problem wasn't in my menu logic, but within the object actually checking to see if the player was standing in the position it should be to open the menu. But once I figured this out, it was amazing. Everything worked exactly how it should, and now you can no longer close the menus while the dialog boxes are open. Now on to the main event. The original name was going to be Bounty Star, but it turns out there's already a game being made with that name. And I'm usually pretty good about looking these things up, but I somehow managed to totally slack off there. So now a new name is needed. Project Bounty can't be the final name for this game. I've come up with a few ideas myself and made some mock-up images for them, and those names are Nova Raider, Bounty Core, and Bounty Rift. I was wanting the name to have something to do with, space and like bounty hunting or being a raider or a pirate or something, and those 3 seem to kind of fit that. And if you're wondering how I came up with those names, I actually used ChatGPT. I went and asked ChatGPT to give me a list of names fitting that criteria, and it gave me a decent list of worthless names. But after siphoning through them and picking what I liked and didn't like, these are the 3 I came up with. So if any of these names stick out to you, please let me know down in the comments. And if you don't like any of these names, let me know that as well. Or if you think you have a better name, feel free to leave that also. And feel free to hit me up on my X account as well. Links down below. Okay, well, I think that's all I've got for this week's video. Be sure to hit that thumbs up if you liked what you saw, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more. Anyways, I'm Jon from Jon Does Game Dev, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Later.